Hey guys, it's Hink here. If you're like me, you were probably deceived by the porn industry into thinking that these guys were like unbelievably massive, and even so much to the point where you thought the average size was way bigger than it actually is. And so today what I wanted to do is break down basically how the porn industry tricks you, bring to light many of the tricks that they use, and also, in some ways this is like a natty or not, because for actual, porn stars members, because there's a lot of artificial things that they do as well. And so that's what we're going to break down today. So stay tuned. So just a disclaimer, guys, this is about porn stars. These are the biggest of the big. I mean, these guys are unequivocally large penised. I mean, there's just no way around that. So at no point am I going to try to convince you that these guys are small or anything like that. The point is to try to convince you that they're not as big as you might think they are, okay? Also, porn is extremely damaging. And so for many different reasons, I'm not going to get into it today, but I would advise you to just stay away from porn for mental health and just your personal reasons. And also just don't get tricked into thinking that you are not enough because of watching porn, etc. So the first thing we need to do is define what is big. And so I'm not going to spend much time on this, but there's something that's called a standard deviation. It's basically the normal variance in a set of data, okay? So many times we're used to thinking about like, oh, the average size. For example, if I were to say, well, the average size, let's just say is 5.5 inches, okay, as far as length, and you're 5.6 inches. Well, does that make you big? It's like, well, kind of, yes, no, depends on how you want to define it. So that's where standard deviation comes in, because if, let's say that, so standard deviation is, like I said, the normal variance in a population. And so you can see what's abnormal outside of that. So if I say that the average is 4, let's just go 4, and the standard deviation is 1, and so plus or minus 1. And so that means if you're anywhere between 3 and 5, you would be within that normal variance, and technically that would not make you an outlier, so it would not make you that big. So if if the average is 4 and you are 4.2, like, yeah, you're bigger than the average, but you're still within that average population. Whereas if the upper limit for the standard deviation is 5 and you are 5.1, then scientifically speaking, you are abnormal, and so you would be abnormally large. And so that's what I would define to say like what's big, okay? And so when you look at CalcSD, it shows that the Western average is about 5.79 inches, and this is bone pressed erect length. And so it has the standard deviation range, which is between basically 4.95 and 6.63. So if you're between 4.9 and 6.6 inches, you're probably within that, you're within that standard deviation range where, of course, if you're on the higher scale or the lower scale, you're still big, on the smaller side respectively, but it does help to bring some real data to this. And so I think if we can define like what is large, in my opinion, it would be outside of that standard deviation range for either length, which is, once again, 5.79 with a range of 4.95 and 6.63. Or when we're talking about girth of 4.7 is kind of the average, with a range of 4.14 to 5.34 inches. If you're outside of that on either way, you're either, particularly large or particularly small, but it helps give some numbers to go into. And so now we're going to get into the porn industry, okay? There are so many ways that they trick you into thinking these guys are massive. There is a really good subreddit. It's called r/measured porn stars, okay? And what they do is they actually, guys with a lot of time on their hands will find either clips or pics that porn stars post, and they will have some sort of reference item. And so it'll be like a remote, and it'll be the guy's dick next to a remote, and you're like, oh, that's big. And then it'll be like, well, actually this remote's dimensions are only like 3 inches in length, so this guy's probably closer to about 4 inches. You get the idea. And so that's where a lot of this is going to come in, okay? And so what is one of the tricks that you can use? Well, honestly, one of the things you can do is go on Amazon, and get a fake ruler where it's artificially smaller. And so like instead of 12 inches being like 12 inches is more like 10 inches. And so if you put your dick up to the ruler, it's going to look like, oh man, it's 11 inches, when really it's not, okay? I've only seen this used very few times, but it is something that they sometimes use, okay? More importantly is that they use terrible measurements. And so, for example, if they're measuring like the base of their banana, if you know what I mean, and here's the ruler here, what they have is, instead of being like, okay, I'm gonna start at the base here, they will actually start the ruler down here, or like near the balls. And so it'll say, oh, well, starting from here, and then you look at like the upper measurement and it's like 10 inches up there, and you're like, wow, that guy's 10 inches. And it's like, well, no, they started down here. If you adjust, it's actually closer to like 6 inches. And they also do what's called off angling. And so I'm standing up measuring my junk here, and so the banana is here, and then they will put the ruler down like this, where it'll angle it up. And so, you know, you don't need basic geometry, but you can see that this measurement is taking into account a much larger area because of the angle, rather than measuring it like you should, like this, okay? And so, you know, I'm gonna try to put up some safer work, like blurred out images where they do this, and it's just extremely deceiving because if you look at the end of the ruler, it'll be like 10, 11 inches, but it has such a steep angle that you know that it's actually not accurate, okay? Another thing that they do is they use wide angle lenses, or like a fisheye lens. And so what that does is objects in the center of the field appear much larger than the objects that are on the outside of the field. BD made actually a good post about this. It's called like how to look instantly bigger with a wide angle lens. And he shows, just using his smartphone, different tricks and tips that you can use to make yourself look potentially bigger or smaller. Now here are some safe for work examples using a banana with iPhone pictures. It's like iPhone 11, where you can see where they introduce this like ultra wide angle lens where you have a normal banana and it looks like it's like this big. And so it can distort reality, make things look bigger. And so when they are filming, they use these wide angle lenses and they zoom in on the D. And so you see this like massive D, and then everything else on the outside appears smaller. And so proportionally, it looks way bigger than it actually is. So the next thing that they do is they have tiny, tiny actresses. Now I'm talking like 5 feet, 4'11", sometimes even smaller. And so of course, you know, if I were to hold this banana, it might not look that big, but if I had a small little actress's hands, this thing would look massive, and that's one of the tricks that they do. And so let's get into hand size a little bit. And so when you're talking about the average breadth of a female hand, so breadth, if you pick up your hand like this and you measure the widest part right at where your fingers meet, that's the breadth, it's 3.1 inches, okay? If you are a guy and you are, let's say 6 inches non-bone pressed, and you have a girl and she has an average hand length, she might be able to get like 2 full hand holds on your D. Imagine if you have a girl that's smaller than average and you have a 6-inch D, and you know, let's say the woman's hand, instead of being 3 inches, is more like 2.5 inches. Well, if you know, she puts both hands up there, that's only 5 inches, there's an inch of D showing. It's gonna make you look even bigger because it's like, wow, she's holding it with 2 hands and there's still all of this room at the top. Ray J, I don't know if you guys even remember who it is, but Kim Kardashian, you certainly know who that is. They made a sex tape. And to this day, like, Ray J is known for having this massive hog, which he does by every single measure have a massive hog. But Kim Kardashian has teeny tiny little hands, and this is kind of a little meme joke here. But when they try to calculate her measurements and they show her and she's like, you know, has 2 hands on his D and there's still like, you know, a significant portion shown at the top, it's like, man, this guy is packing. It's like, well, Kim Kardashian is also tiny, below average. Another thing that the porn stars do is they use other parts of the anatomy to try to show how large they are. So like forearms, for example. I put up this chart here so when you can look at like male versus female forearm height. And so keep in mind that 20 centimeters is about 7.8 inches for the guys in the US. And so when you see a picture of a forearm, on average, it's, you know, it's on a female, it's probably somewhere around 8 inches total from basically just the length of the forearm. And so what these porn guys will do, well, they'll put up their D next to a forearm, and you're like, oh my gosh, you know, wow, it's the size of her forearm. But once again, there's a couple tricks they do. Number one is they have teeny tiny actresses that have, instead of having a 20 centimeter forearm, they might have closer to like an 18 centimeter forearm or even 17 centimeter forearm, and like, you know, a 6 or 7 inch forearm. And so when they put their D up next to it, it's not that big of a forearm, so it's still impressive by every measure. Don't get me wrong here, guys, but it's just not as impressive as they make you think. You know, for example, my hand size, you know, I actually don't have particularly big hands considering my height, but, you know, measured stem to stern, so this is a 20 centimeter ruler here, and, you know, my hand size is probably right at about like, I don't know, 7.5 inches or so. Let's say I'm 7.5 inches non-bone pressed, which this is just for illustrative purposes. I'm not commenting on my size at all. And I put it next to my forearm here. You know, I can almost make it seem like if we're starting, forearm starts here and this is the top here, I can almost make it seem like like, whoa, especially if I angle it more, that, yeah, man, my hand length is the same size as my forearm. You know, maybe that's not the best example, I don't know, but all right, so let's take this banana here, okay? So this banana here is basically the same length as my hand. And if I put this banana up next to my forearm, if I angle it like this, you know, you can actually see like, oh, wow, yeah, the banana's the same size as my forearm, wow. So that's one thing they do. The next thing they do is have the girl, just like the ruler, angle their forearm. So if this is the banana here and I angle my forearm down like this, and so you're measuring the distance from, let's say here, like down to here, you know, and that's how I'm comparing it. That's not a very good example. I'm gonna put up some pictures here, guys. Okay, you'll see these porn stars, they will angle their forearm down, and so the length of the forearm does not correlate with the actual length. It's more like the hypotenuse for those that want to get like geometrical here. You basically get this false impression that these guys are as big as these girls' forearms, when in many cases they put it up next to it and there's still like this much forearm that's left. And once again, if we're saying the average female forearm is about 7.8 inches, and then they put up their D and there's still an inch left, that's like 6 inches non-bone pressed. And so still very big, don't get me wrong, guys. There's just a lot of tricks that they do. The other thing that they'll do is they'll crop out the body, and so you can only see the D. And so if you're a large guy, and so any of my large guys already know this, you have big thighs, you're just, you know, maybe a little weight, whatever. Basically, the smaller the plate, the bigger the steak looks. If you're a really big guy and you have a big dick, if you see both big guy and big dick, you don't proportionally look that big. Whereas if you zoom in and you just see a big dick and a tiny little porn star, you think these people are massive. So that's why in a lot of the films, you actually don't see that many guys that are actually, you don't see their whole body for that much, especially when things start to get particularly intimate or they zoom in, especially on things like blowjobs, handjobs, etc. And the guys that they do show their full body are usually smaller guys that, once again, you know, are packing like, you know, 7 inches non-bone pressed, but when you're 5'6" and very skinny and you're packing 7 inches non-bone pressed, you're gonna look like it's 14 inches. Another thing that they do, which is not really related to D size, is faking orgasm, guys. These women are professional actresses, okay? No, they're not out winning, you know, Golden Globes or whatever, but they are literally taught how to fake an orgasm to make it look more realistic. And so if you think that these girls are just coming with like this, you know, hard penetration from a big dick, that is not accurate in real life. It takes much more than that, and that's another story for another day. But fun fact, even squirting orgasms, guys, squirting orgasms, there's not like ejaculate or anything. It's urine, it's piss, guys. They actually did a study, which I'll put up here, believe it or not, a funded study to show that when women do have a female squirting orgasms, it's just piss, guys. And so how hard would it be to like fake a moan and piss? Not that hard, okay? Another thing that these guys use is they have extremely low body fats. And so here's a picture of Johnny Sins right here. Now Johnny Sins, I'll kind of cut to the chase. He's about 7 to maybe 7.5 at the most, non-bone pressed, depending on how lean he is. But when he is like rail thin like that and just like chiseled to the bone, it's gonna look a lot bigger than somebody who has a much bigger waist. So take, for example, this picture of this woman here, okay? Imagine that there is like a phallus-shaped object out in front. If that object is gonna look the biggest, even though the object would stay the same, it'd kind of be an optical illusion, but on the thinnest model, it's gonna look the biggest because of the proportional things. Finally, they use like a favorable, like an under view angle, and I'll put up 2 pictures of me holding a banana. And so when you're looking from like basically the top down, it doesn't look that big. But if you hold the banana and you're filming up from this side and you catch the underside, and then like the rest of your body and head and all these things are proportionally in the background, but because they're in the background, they're smaller, like this, you're like, whoa, that thing looks way bigger than if I were to turn around and I were to hold it like this. You know, it's the same size banana, but because of more of my stuff is in the foreground, it doesn't look nearly as big. And so that is something to keep in mind as well. Fake dicks, guys. A lot of these porn companies use fake dicks. How can you tell if it's a fake dick? Well, number one, they never move their hand from the base. Their hand is at the base the entire time. They either have on shorts or pants, so you can never see the actual appropriate anatomy. There's no fluctuation in erection quality. From the time there is basically foreplay to the time after an orgasm, there's no change in erection quality whatsoever. And then they even fake orgasms with this, okay? Some guys have like a a fetish where they want to see like these unrealistic cum shots. And so they can fake that, even like the pulsatile nature from the bulbospongiosus muscle contracting, they can make it look very realistic, okay? And so we'll get into the natty or not section here. And so like, how do you know if a porn star is natty or not? I'm talking particularly from like the penis standpoint, okay? A lot of porn stars pump before their shoots to get mostly flaccid gains. Anybody that's pumped before knows that you can get a nice pump where your dick is just nice and plump and hangs low. And so if you have a woman and she's telling down your shorts and there's this like nice hanging thick flaccid dick, they're gonna be like, oh, and have the thumbnail or whatever. There's rumors that Shane Diesel, if you don't know who he is, you're a good person, but he is a notorious pumper. Testosterone use, okay? So many of these guys are on exogenous testosterone steroids that it causes their balls to shrink away and basically disappear. And so if you actually were to look at their scrotums are sometimes empty. Along with that, if their nuts are teeny tiny, and so the actual corpus spongiosum runs from obviously the tip of your dick all the way up under and connects right before your anus. And so normally, let's say, you know, your dick is from here to here, your balls and scrotum are here and here, and then you have your anal canal here or your anus here. If you don't have nuts, it just looks like, all you see is like dick from like the tip of the penis all the way back to the anus, and it looks massive. And if you're not looking for it, you're like, why does that look so big? And then you're like, oh, this guy doesn't have nuts. It's because of steroid use, okay? You can sometimes see shaft discoloration. There was a gentleman that I happened to have stumbled upon, and he had this crazy hemosiderin staining, which I'll put up a picture. If you haven't seen my video on why you have discoloration with PE, check out the video. But he had like major hemosiderin staining, so he was clearly pumping. Then I look closer, and he had this big bloated dick, which puts me to the next point. If you see a guy and he has like a bunch of edema, and even like what we call a donut edema, which is a little rim of edema right around the penis, right just below the head, you know, this guy has been pumping up before his shoot. And you can normally see that it's not like your standard hard dick. You can see it looks like puffy and it looks softer, even though he appears to be fully erect. It's just because of the extra third place spacing of the fluid that's occurred. Sometimes a turkey neck, okay, that little dangling between, you know, the base of your penis and your scrotum. If you are engaging in some forms of PE, that can actually, as you're like stretching that tissue, it can draw the turkey neck out. And so if they have a very prominent turkey neck, it could be just bad genes. It could be from that. Hair migration. So as similar to turkey neck, as you're stretching out your penis, hair tends to migrate from like the base of your penis and pubic area up onto your shaft. And so if you see that their shaft hair is moving up onto their penis, they're probably doing some sort of enlargement technique like hanging, for example. And of course, things like PEDs, so injecting Trimix or Viagra to give themselves a super physiologically hard erection will make you look not artificially larger. The harder your dick is, the bigger your dick is going to be, kind of period, the end. And so if you are taking drugs to absolutely maximize that and take it above normal, it's going to look crazy. And for those of you that are old enough to like look at older porn from like the 80s and 90s, their dicks don't look the same because it's actually a natural erection, whereas like nowadays it's like 10 out of 10 hardness. Back in like the 80s and 90s, it was probably closer to like an 8 or a 9 out of 10, just because they didn't have these drugs like Viagra. They just weren't around then, okay? This is a very interesting one, and this is a subtle finding. And so they have a very small head or very small glands in proportion to the rest of their penis. They could have something that's called basically megalophallus. If you haven't seen my video on megalophallus, what can happen, especially in people with sickle cell disease, which is more common in African Americans, or BBC, for example, but basically these chronic super hard erections from having the sickle cell disease causes the actual penis to enlarge. And I'm talking like enlarged to girth diameters of like 8 to 10 inches of girth. I mean like massive girth because of this disease. However, it never affects the glands of the penis and it never affects the corpus spongiosum. And so if they have these really thick shafts, but their head doesn't look that big, they could have megalophallus. Shorty Mac and even Vlad the Impaler, I'll put up pictures of their like faces up here, but if you look closely, there's rumors that they have had this happen to him. And so finally, I just want to touch on some of the actual like real statistics as best we can guess from these performers, okay? In general, this is porn standards, okay? So these are non-bone press standards. If you are 7 inches non-bone pressed, you are big. If you are 8 inches non-bone pressed, you are absolutely huge. And if you are like 9 inches non-bone pressed, I mean, that's like the biggest in the industry that you will ever see. So we need to scale down from thinking like the biggest guys in the industry are 12 inches to more like 8 or 9 inches, okay? And so Johnny Sins, I already touched on this. He's about 7 inches non-bone pressed, okay? Very big, don't get me wrong, but not as big as you might think. Sean Lawless, so there's a famous scene with Mia Khalifa. He's 7.1 inches non-bone pressed. Chris Strokes, He's 7.4 inches non-bone pressed. Shane Diesel, and we're talking about length here, not girth, but he's about 7.5 inches non-bone pressed. And once again, when you look at some of these performers, which you can see that it'll list like their name and show their proportion to a female's forearm, and they're not exceeding the forearm length. And so once again, that's going to be probably 8 inches at the biggest. And so these guys are usually less than 8 inches non-bone pressed. It's just reality. These guys are massive. Don't get me wrong. They're just not as big as you might think. Anyways, I hope this was helpful. I hope this brings a more realistic view of porn and kind of fills you in on some of the tips and tricks. And I don't know, maybe some of you guys can even use these to your behalf. I personally advise you to avoid all kind of porn altogether. Just don't be tricked. So good for working out. If you need any injury support or coaching, that is my Patreon, Doc Hink, and I'll catch you guys on the next one.